Hey everyone, welcome to season 2 of Reversing Climate Change. We are doing that podcast thing now and launching a Patreon. You can find it at patreon.com/NoriPodcasts. There are various tiers with different types of goodies available. Do you want to receive a special newsletter digest of what Nori Knots are reading that week? Be a part of a Nori book club. Get special access to Nori events. Go take a look at patreon.com/NoriPodcast for what we're offering. And in that spirit of being lean in that startup kind of way that, we like to do, this list of goodies is subject to change, and we'd very much like your feedback. Is there something that you'd really like to see, but it isn't listed here? Honest feedback does a lot to help us shape what we offer to you. You can send an email to podcast@nori.com or fill out our podcast survey anonymously in our newsletter, which you can find at nori.com/subscribe. And thank you so much for listening to another season of Reversing Climate Change. Hello and welcome to the Reversing Climate Change podcast. I'm Ross Kenyon. Today I have with me Dr. Nick Cowen of the University of Lincoln. He wrote a paper along with a co-author, Dr. Charles Delmott, called Cost and Choice in the Commons, Ostrom in the Case of British Flood Management. Thanks for being here, Nick.
Oh, it's great to be here, Ross. Great to be here, actually. I think in some ways the kind of this pandemic situation kind of brought us to have this conversation because, I find myself in front of a screen, talking to students, talking to potential graduate students, and I kind of realize, wow, I've kind of got this, I'm all set up finally. Finally, I can talk to Ross and appear on the podcast. So it's, I'm really looking forward to it.
Your lobbying efforts of me were successful, because I have long wanted to do an episode about the Bloomington School, about new institutional economics, about Elinor Ostrom, common pool resources. It is time. You have the discreet pleasure of being the one to introduce this. So your lobbying could not have come at a better time, Nick.
Fantastic.
Indeed, and I'm not sure who out there listening knows much about Elinor Ostrom. She's a Nobel laureate in economics. Her husband, political scientist. They're both deceased. They actually died very near to each other. Wasn't it like a month or two apart? It was very close, wasn't it?
Yes. It was a tragedy for for the world of liberal political economy and for academia in general. In fact, I believe I had the opportunity to meet her just a few months before she died. She gave a talk at the Institute of Economic Affairs on her work, focusing actually a great deal on her workshop method. She always used to joke, actually perhaps she wasn't joking, but she always used to say that she wasn't sure if she actually could hack it as a political scientist. So she also learned some crafting. She kind of did some wood furniture crafting, and she went out to Bloomington, which I'm not sure if it was on the map at the time when she went out there. It certainly is on the map now, Bloomington in Indiana. She, and basically she kind of developed a kind of way of working with graduate students and people across the world, which she called the workshop, I suppose, which is, in contrast to a seminar or a kind of conference framework, where basically work was kind of co-produced. And it's interesting that, of course, a lot of her research is looking at kind of scenarios like that. And there she is actually kind of like building it into her own work. So if you kind of look at her CV or look at her Google Scholar page, so, Elinor Ostrom, just take a look, you'll see enormous stuff that she's written personally, but also an enormous number of varied collaborations. And, I think the testament to it is really that she's a political scientist. She was told she couldn't quite manage it as an economist. And eventually she won the Nobel Prize in economics. Sadly, there is no Nobel Prize in political science. Well, perhaps that's a good thing. But, that kind of shows the kind of extent of her interdisciplinarity.
That's a nice summation. And we should get into what sorts of problems was she trying to solve with her intellectual legacy while she was alive. And maybe the best way to do so is to start with the tragedy of the commons, which, depending on how you're approaching environmental and climate issues, is either a thought experiment that you hate, that you're sick of talking about, or that you think it's just much more complicated than it's typically presented. So let's tell the simple story of what exactly the tragedy of the commons is, and then we'll get into how Elinor Ostrom complicated it, but also made it legible in a very useful way as well.
Yeah, no, that's right. So, under the sort of classic tragedy of the commons scenario, you kind of imagine that you've got a pasture that's kind of used by, say, a lot of shepherds with their own flocks. So there's a kind of, there's a kind of common area which everyone can access, and basically without coercion, without some rules to manage that area, you're going to end up overusing it. So you're going to end up, turning your grassland into a plain and eventually into a desert. And then, everyone's animals are going to starve, and everyone's eventually going to be put into a great deal of poverty. And so the traditional answer to this is to say, well, you probably need to privatize that commons. You need to kind of take some parcels of land, and you're going to give that to these shepherds. I suppose they're going to become farmers instead of some sort, because they're not going to be roaming anymore. And that's going to be your solution. They're going to shepherd, they're going to look after their own resources, and that way, that will be the way of maintaining it. And if for some reason privatization isn't going to work, well, you're going to have, some big guy, the state or some proto-state is going to have to come along and keep an eye on what people are doing and basically license the ability of people who want to use the pasture. Basically, you're going to got this dilemma. Well, or, you've got like these two solutions that are kind of meant to work: privatization or state control. That was the kind of setup that Ostrom initially encountered.
Okay, that's great, Nick. That's a nice way to start the conversation. And it also breaks neatly along left-right lines, too. You have people on the left typically prefer the government to either set regulations or to control this asset. And then you have people on the right who tend to trust the market and private property to do this. So this sort of makes sense. And maybe just to refresh people in case we covered it a bit too quickly, but the problem is if this pasture is commons, I'm putting this in quotes because we're going to complicate this story here in just a second. It's unowned or it's in quote unquote commons. It just means that people can run their cows or their goats or their sheep up into the commons and graze it. But if you leave any grass there, who's to say your neighbor's not just going to send their cows up and eat it the next day? So your incentive is to consume as fast as possible for yourself. And that is the tragedy of the commons when that happens. There's no clear property rights. So everyone who's using this resource, the incentive is to just go for it. Is that broadly the case?
That's right. And having the correct enforcement mechanism, essentially mutual or peer enforcement in many cases, this allowed them to preserve this common resource after all. Hence, the tragedy of the commons was not quite so tragic after all. It was more of a drama.
Yeah, how many times have you said that line?
Actually, it's the first time I've said it. I've read it quite a bit, though.
You should write that down. Yeah. It's a good one. That's good. So I associate, I think maybe the first thing I read by Elinor Ostrom, I think it's her Nobel acceptance speech was where I started. And it was Beyond Markets and States. And it was this interesting idea about the details matter, which sounds kind of banal when you think about it. Of course, the details matter more than like it isn't. You can't just say property rights, or you can't just say state ownership or regulation, and that's the end of the conversation. Clearly, there are good versions and bad versions of both, and there are places where these should apply and places where they should not. And she was very interested in looking at actual empirical examples where people have solved their own problems collectively. And these are often in relatively smaller environments where people tend to know each other. They can enforce norms against each other and punish each other in ways that are maybe less formal. Is this characterization, hitting the mark, or am I misreading her?
Very, very much so. I mean, it's interesting because, of course, the fact that something is communal and kind of involves a close-knit community doesn't necessarily mean that it's informal. It might involve quite a lot of formal rules. So that's like another dimension to kind of look at. And, formal rules have their kind of costs as well, but often they're necessary, even in a small group, just so that everyone knows, where they stand. So yeah, once again, it's another detail to kind of add to Ostrom's discovery.
Yeah, we're going to get into that too. That is one of the things that is most useful about her methodological lenses that she uses, but also one of the things that makes it quite difficult to apply, given that it is so place-based and unique and bespoke in all of the times when it exists. Maybe we should give people an example here. Do you have a good example of an Ostromian institution that you can just pull out of your hat and display?
I must say, that's a little bit of a challenge because I know that she tends to look at fisheries a great deal, and I think one of the most successful cases of commons that she looks at is in a series of lakes in Turkey. So very, very long-lived commons institutions where basically they, in a sense, quite informal because, you kind of got these fishermen kind of living in some cases quite far apart, but they kind of have a rule on when they're allowed to fish. And importantly, the individual who's allowed to fish in a particular time period, they are also in charge of enforcing the rule, which is kind of like, it means it's a sort of self-enforcing kind of element to it. So it's sort of saying, well, for the sake of this time right now, this is kind of your property, but you have to look after it. So I think that's the kind of examples that she came up with over the years.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the examples I've heard from James C. Scott, who, as we like to say on the podcast, we're coming for you, James C. Scott, because your work has made a big influence on me, and I think it's very interesting. He'll talk about how private property, as we conceive of it, is pretty simple. But property rights prior to private property as we currently understand it is oftentimes quite rotational and confusing and opaque to outsiders. So you'll have examples like peasants will say, okay, your family owns this pasture this season, but the next pasture switches, and then you'll pick up this other one, and then we'll keep trading in this sort of like complex weave of property rights and who gets to do what and when. It isn't something that's just formalized that you can go to a court and look up who owns this piece of land, fee simple. It's actually something much more confusing than that, but it works, right? So for the people who live there, it is very functional, but for outsiders, it is not something easily able to interact with.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, as sort of James Scott kind of illustrates, a lot of the times when we've officially formalized or codified property rights, it's not the fact that they weren't particularly formal before, it's just that they were opaque to the state. And states don't like things that are opaque. The state doesn't mind being opaque to the people, but it doesn't like the people to be opaque to it because it probably wants to tax them, find out how many resources, maybe if anyone is eligible for military conscription. That's the sort of thing states tend to worry about. And so it's very important that your property rights are kind of transparent to the state for when it's attempting to achieve its ends. So naturally, if we're looking at this from a kind of more critical standpoint, we're not just thinking about what's in the state's interest. We're thinking, for example, about what's in the ecological interest, what's in the genuine public interest. Then we'd often say, well, those property rights, confusing, opaque, awkward to manage as they were, probably solved a lot of problems for the inhabitants who were there. And they maybe made a decision not to formalize them, not to make them as transparent initially. We shouldn't necessarily judge them for that. And perhaps we should try and kind of revive a kind of broader notion of property rights, one that kind of includes these kind of complex communal arrangements.
Nick, what do you think is the appropriate place to apply all of these paradigms? On the one hand, you have the sort of like free market private property solution where you have the pastures and you say, this family owns this plot of the pastures, this other family owns this, they can do what they want with it, they can sell it, they can use it, etc. And the hope there is that because you own it year after year, you want to see that a resource increase in value. So you're not going to just eat everything, and your cows aren't. You're going to want to foster it. And the other approach is regulation and or government control in some variety. And when might that be appropriate too? Because there are some things that are good about it and there are other things that are bad about it, same as private property rights. What is the Ostromian approach or the polycentric governance approach here? Is this, because this is sort of like emergent, is it something that we can actually even apply like those other two examples of paradigms? Because it might just be something that like grows out of a certain community. You can't just drop Ostrom on a place and expect it to happen, or can you?
Absolutely not. Well, it depends. Some people, saw all these, long-lived commons institutions that Ostrom, kind of observed and kind of made, a little bit more transparent to the scholars and to the policymakers. And some of them kind of attempted to go like, oh, wow, commons are great. They're not state, they're not private, they're not like state socialism, and they're not like capitalism either. Let's go for this kind of third way. And that is not really the lesson that Ostrom was really pushing, at least in my reading. So it's exactly what you're saying. The main lesson is you can't apply a set of mechanisms or a set of principles at all times and in all places. Rather, you've got to see what has been working and try and work out if something is not working, what exactly is stopping the people there from fixing it. And, I think the reason is often that the full set of people's governance arrangements, including individual rights and possibly market principles, but also the communal arrangements that are there, they might not be being recognized. They might not be respected appropriately. And that's preventing people from making sufficient long-term planning. Because, there's not that many people out there who actively want to destroy the environment. Many just think, well, I need to live. I need to, look after my own well-being, and no one else is looking after it. Therefore, I've just got to, I've just got to get mine while I can. Very few people want to be in that position. But if the rules are failing, they will end up. So I think that's the kind of the first part. If I wanted to give an example of where I think regulation appears to have done very successfully, I think it would be the kind of regulation to save the ozone. So, the kind of gases that were kind of being given off in the 1980s that we were using, in our fridges and whatnot. It's very hard for me to imagine either a market solution to that or a kind of common solution. It's a kind of global public good problem, the ozone layer. So, saving it, that may well have been a case where, much as, I'm usually a little skeptical of kind of regulation, that's the kind of case where you'd need it. Another example, I think, might be with carbon emissions. It strikes me, this is not the same as banning, CFC emissions, but it strikes me that a carbon tax might well be necessary to kind of get stuff off the ground. Either a global carbon tax or at least a carbon tax that an enormous amount of the world has kind of opted into. And that's because basically you're dealing with a kind of global commons at that kind of level with the atmosphere itself. That's where I think you might need some state involvement. That's not to say the state is the only actor that's going to be in operation. Once you've got a carbon tax, hopefully you can kind of unleash the kind of innovation that will lead to people being able to pay that carbon tax or be able to kind of reduce the amount of carbon that they're emitting on net in the most efficient way possible. And that's where both private property market solutions and common solutions might come back in.
That was beautiful. That was a very nice way to conceptualize it. I like that. I try not to be too ideological about any of this stuff. I think it's important to, God, I know this is banal, but the details matter, right? We really want to make sure that we're applying the right paradigm in the right place. Because, man, there are people I know on every side of this that have that everything looks like a nail when all you have is a hammer mentality. So I definitely know some free market libertarian types, and it's just privatize everything is a solution. You're there are cases where this is worse than the alternative. And there are definitely people I know who would favor regulation before they even know what the regulation entails. They're attracted to that idea. And you're okay, there are cases where the dynamism of markets and decentralization can be very powerful. And then also, with people I know on the commons front, they're very fond of talking about systems thinking and complexity. But I have often found that those conversations become very muddled. There's not a bright line that I can pull out. It's just sort of well, you have to look at everything holistically. And it's okay, but I'm not even sure what you're saying then, because it's how do you look at everything holistically and interact in a complex system? It just becomes a dog's breakfast, as your countrymen might say.
Yeah, yes.
Is that your experience too?
Yeah, but that's what my first drafts always look like. Far too many factors, far too many variables, far too many things that are kind of moving in a system. And then what you kind of got to do is identify what's kind of going on that we can kind of say, yeah, that makes a big difference. And that's kind of robust to the other things that are kind of going on in the model. So, an important thing in these cases is perhaps the notion of residual-claimancy. So it's this old, sort of common law notion that, there's a kind of a landlord or someone who has a kind of strong fundamental claim on a piece of land or territory or piece of property, such that, if it's destroyed or disposed of in some way, they're the ones who kind of bear the cost. They don't get discounted for it. On the other hand, if there's kind of some excess profit associated with it, they also receive the benefit. And that kind of makes people a little bit more observant about what's going on. And I think an important observation that Ostrom, especially on the kind of more classical liberal side of the of kind of Ostrom, she has many dimensions, but there's on that side, is to say that it's not just individuals or kind of corporations that have that kind of potential. Various other communities and various other kind of governance arrangements can necessarily benefit from residual claimancy.
It's a great $5 word or $5 concept right there. Residual claimancy. Try to shoehorn that into your daily discussion, listener. Get that out there. Okay, we're here to talk about your paper, though. So I think we did a really nice job. Thank you for doing so, of explaining the basics here. And let's dive into a topic that you clearly know a lot about, which is British flood management and how these paradigms have been applied to varying degrees of success or failure.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I suppose I'm an expert on flood management in the sense that I've been living in Britain for a long time, and about twice a year we get a lot of flooding, and then we also get a lot of complaints about flooding. The public sector is not doing enough. Whole villages or towns have kind of been flooded, and they're always saying, well, the government should have done more. They should make sure that everyone gets subsidized insurance. They should make sure that the rivers are appropriately dredged so that water can flow more quickly. And there's always a big debate about this. Basically, the government says, well, it's got increasingly expensive to kind of like have all this flood management in place that we're paying for, that we sort of, eventually the taxpayers are paying for. And that's because, well, one reason is because of climate change. So, we're getting more storms, we're getting more floods, we're getting more unpredictable water turning up in kind of weird places. But the other side is that the government has become a little bit more environmentally conscious over the years. And basically, it now realizes that these kind of wetland territories that the government itself was aggressively draining in the immediate post-war era. Like, who wants wetlands? Who wants marshlands? It's just like you can't grow anything on there. It's not economically productive. Suddenly, we've got a new kind of social ethos that now realizes that actually a lot of this stuff, which is kind of like floodplain territory, has some very unique environmental features. And so the government's in a bit of a bind here because people are kind of living and working on this territory. They expect the government to protect them, to make sure that they're not going to be flooded out. But on the other hand, public policy is now saying, well, actually, not all of this territory really should be, quite so heavily used. In fact, it should be set aside, for this kind of unique wildlife that used to be there and could be there again. So I found that kind of fascinating because it seemed like the government really was in a total bind. And it kind of got itself into this system, into this kind of, into this business of handling flood from a kind of national planning perspective. And then suddenly it found it couldn't really afford it. And it found that everyone's pissed off with them at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. So that's kind of what got me interested in this particular topic.
I love that. That's such a great case. I associate this too. Here's another sort of libertarian classic that I think has something important to say, which is Ludwig von Mises's insights on intervention, where you have something that wouldn't have happened without the government's involvement. And then that changed the course of behavior in a reaction to that. So people should not have lived in these floodplains. The government made it possible and sort of encouraged it. And once people are there, you require increasingly more interventions to sustain this system that really never should have existed in the first place, but becomes politically impossible to change. Is this a correct application of that idea?
That's right. And in a sense, I would go further. I mean, it's very hard to piece together who's benefiting and who's losing from these series of interventions. But I think it looks rather like what Gordon Tullock calls a transitional gains trap. And that's where you kind of introduce a policy which has some very immediate beneficiaries. In this case, it would be the people who are paid to engage in some river management, paid to drain various territories. And then as soon as that's happened, as soon as that benefit has been accrued, everything else is costs. Because everyone is in a kind of funny state because people have moved in, they've moved into an area which they thought was going to be flood protected. The government suddenly has to keep paying to keep that going, doesn't want to do it anymore. The people, if they'd known about that they would suffer from flooding, wouldn't have wanted to move in there in the first place. The various processes that went on encouraged them to move in there. Everyone would like to be in a different position. And yet there's no way of kind of actually making people better off without, bailing everyone out, which is like one way out of a transitional gains trap. And that means basically you share the burden on the whole tax base. So it's a nasty position that we've got ourselves into.
Oh yeah, I don't even know how the justice questions that come up in that are so complicated. What a shame that all is. Okay, so what has happened with these, like the way your paper is partitioned too, you talk about attempts to either privatize and use private property to address this, or various types of regulation, and also maybe a possible Ostromian way forward. Can you lay those out for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a sense, the situation that we're in now is a kind of result not just of public regulation. In fact, unfortunately, it's someone who occasionally I've agreed with, Margaret Thatcher and her administration, who kind of came on and said, like, no, the government shouldn't be getting involved in all these things. The private sector, that solves everything. So this is like the other side of that binary. And what she and her subsequent, administrations did was basically privatize a lot of water provision and water management in the United Kingdom, and kind of put them in charge of doing a great deal of kind of flood management. And so, basically required people to kind of pay fees to kind of, to these private companies. For the kind of remaining, I suppose, pure public good elements, we ended up with a very highly centralized national agency called the Environment Agency, which is basically in charge of kind of, I suppose, more proactive flood management. Local communities under the regime, up until very recently, haven't really had that much involvement. And I think what was interesting about this is if you look back in the, in the history, when you realize how drainage and flood management was managed, we don't actually know that much about it, precisely because of this kind of, Scott's insight that, if your system is quite opaque and quite local and quite particularistic or quite peculiar, then it's very hard to kind of figure it out how it fits into the rest of the system. But evidently, it was quite functional. That was standardized when the government introduced in the early 20th century internal drainage boards, which appear to have been basically controlled by local landowners and farmers. They kind of had some of the properties of local cooperatives, and they kind of levied fees on each other locally. And that was kind of how they managed floods for a while. And it was only really when the government noticed that a lot of territory was just being allowed to be flooded, because at the time, a lot of the land wasn't really worth farming, or it wasn't worth developing in a particular way, that the government said, like, okay, no, we don't want these people handling this stuff anymore. They're clearly being lazy. And that's when they started subsidizing and pushing for kind of, I suppose, more land reclamation. And one thing that we observe in the paper is that although the idea was to try and encourage farmers, or rather more farmers, to use more land and kind of turn it into basically increase agricultural production, generally it wasn't used that way unless very specifically incentivized. And that's because, labor costs are relatively high in the UK, and a lot of food production is not it's not to our comparative advantage to kind of be producing that much food. So it's kind of like a kind of mix of kind of public intervention at first, and then this kind of austerity pulling back of the state that kind of led to the mess that we're in now. And the reason why that happened is because, we were operating on this binary that basically said that all social problems either have to be solved by the market, and if the market isn't running it well, then the state has got to get its heavy hands in and solve it. Whereas if they'd looked a little bit more carefully at what the farmers themselves were up to, they would have seen some quite, sophisticated ways of engaging in flood management. If you don't mind me teleporting to today a little bit. So everyone loves trees. And I know that you guys kind of think about trees as well, because it's part of, kind of potentially carbon sequestration. I know it's not as efficient as it ought to be, but it's everyone likes it. And actually, we want more, especially in these kind of floodplain areas, because they do wonders if you can kind of put them in the right place along riverbanks, because they kind of strengthen the soil, which means that, the rivers can kind of keep their shape and can kind of continue the flow of water in some ways. Now, everyone kind of wants this, so everyone from an ecological perspective thinks it's great. The trouble is getting people to actually implement it, because of course it's not something that you can just like plonk down, whether it's like a market paying for trees or the state kind of saying, oh, this is how it should be done. It requires local knowledge of the way these rivers are constructed, where the kind of of weak points are, and also where people can best set aside land to kind of plant these trees. The other problem with it is, of course, water doesn't stick to property lines. So it's not like landowners themselves can do it entirely on their own bat on their own land, because if they do it alone, well, they'll receive some benefit, but not most of it. Most of it will go to the local community. And also, you probably need quite a lot of it spread over a given territory in order to make a sufficient difference. So basically, our argument is that we would expect, once the state has taken a step back, to see communal arrangements emerge, which is going to kind of make, more use of these kind of sophisticated, kind of lighter touch approaches to flood management. That's our hope anyway.
That makes sense to me. One of the more prominent critiques of subsidiarity, which is a fancy word for saying things should be taken care of at the most local level possible, the smallest scale possible, is that people worry that one of the good things about having the government or the state do something is that there's a guarantee that's publicly stated that they have an obligation to do things. And even if it's too standardized across diverse populations and geographies, it's at least like the baseline, and that's clearly stated. But people worry that if you just removed that, who's to say that some of these more communal arrangements would actually spring up and we might just be left worse off without having anything replace the government at all?
Yeah, I mean, and that takes us back to the transitional gains trap problem, which is sort of like, well, what if it turns out that it doesn't matter how many trees or how much dredging, how much kind of sluice gates you install, it's still going to be prohibitively expensive to prevent some land from being flooded and people are living there. That's very, very awkward. That's the kind of moment where you might think that some sort of state buyout arrangement might be necessary just to try and fix the problems that people are there, right now. So in other words, you wouldn't want to start from where you are. But actually, in principle, we probably have, kind of overmanaged floods. We've engaged in too much prevention in the UK over the years. Environmentalists would say that, there was, decent habitats that wasn't particularly agriculturally productive, but was productive in other ways and ecologically important that we should have saved. And now we should be recovering. And that means that if, and if communal arrangements, if there's no arrangement where some residual claimants can work out how to make some land productive, then it should not be productive. It should be part of the ecosystem. It should be returned to nature in some way. Another possibility is, of course, sometimes environmentalists have, quite deep pockets and they're very committed to their ideas and they see the value in, natural habitats and in kind of keeping some resources in the ground or keeping some territories open for kind of nature to develop or for kind of careful cultivation, but not for industrial use. And obviously, giving them the right to acquire property rights, consensually. So in other words, buying people out. That is also a kind of another potential solution that I think that the kind of more light touch approach can allow. Because right now, we kind of heavily subsidize farming and agriculture. This is something that was present before we entered the European Union. It was a big problem when we were in the European Union and now we're leaving. We're going to have to revisit that. But basically, we've encouraged farming on a kind of scale that's much larger than we really needed in this country. And as a result, the kind of, both the price signals in terms of what's productive, they've been attenuated, but also we've tread too strongly, on the environment while doing that. So, part of the point of this solution is actually that there isn't always a solution. Sometimes we should just retreat and, we should let the water come in.
Wow, I'm tickled by all of that. You got away with words, Nick. I enjoy just listening to you explain economics to me. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. It's. I must say at this point that my PhD is in politics, not economics. So you have to get Brian Kaplan back on to make sure that I've got it right. Actually, having said that, I'll say another point of inspiration for this paper is two great scholars. One a lawyer, one an economist. So there's a Professor Karen Bradshaw and also Professor Brian Leonard. I think they're both based in Arizona. So I'm sure you've come across them, actually, even if maybe you've even had them on the podcast already. But if not, you should definitely get them on the list because they have some very interesting discussions in this area.
Great. Yeah, I'll look into that. Arizona. I mean, at ASU, they had Elinor and Vincent Ostrom. Her husband was a political scientist as well. There was some sort of center there, but it was prior to my understanding really what they were up to when I was an undergrad there. I guess one of the final questions to leave our audience with here too, hopefully this has whet their appetite for more discussions of this ilk, is this crossover seems really powerful to me. I can see like some of the people that I know who most like this third way beyond markets and states. A lot of them are sort of regenerative finance, regenerative economics, permaculture. They're people who are thinking about ways of either reforming or replacing capitalism with something that is also dynamic, but it tends to have more of like a left-wing flavor to it. And then some of the people I know who really like her work too, and others from the Bloomington School. She, was at Bloomington, Indiana, so it's often called the Bloomington School way of thinking. A lot of people I know who like her are often people who very much admire people like F.A. Hayek and other sort of classical liberal free market thinkers who say this is actually really appealing to me as well. How much interaction do you see between these two camps within discussions about Ostrom's legacy? Or am I just imagining this, or are they even in touch with each other? Because I don't really see that much of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's that much intellectual interaction going on at the moment. I think it might just be the nature of, there's geographical splits and there's also disciplinary splits that are kind of going on. I mean, I think, in answer to this idea that you can replace capitalism, I mean, capitalism is a very controversial word. I prefer to talk about commercial society and markets, although capital does come into my system. I don't see why it should have to be at the center of the system. But what I'd say is that I think there's some increasing body of evidence that suggests that you actually get more sophisticated communal commons arrangements when the products they're producing are appropriately commodified, or indeed where there's kind of deeper markets in place. It's kind of like where I see some of the work that, you're doing at Norrie kind of working that, if, for example, you can supply a carbon market, if you become a carbon market maker and you actually make it work and it's like not as complicated as it is to kind of get certification as it is right now, then what would happen is some people would suddenly realize, like me acquiring my microphone to do this podcast for slightly different reasons, but, I've got it. Farmers, landowners, other people who can potentially make use of their resources to engage in carbon sequestration or other ways of mitigating climate change, they would realize that it actually makes sense at this point for them to form governance arrangements, to perhaps establish a company or a not-for-profit firm or some kind of more complex, even more opaque communal system, depending on the regime that they're in. And the market would actually encourage them to do it. So I think in many cases, markets that respect private property and also respect communal property, in other words, not kind of the sort of markets that are used to kind of, go and take people's property, the ones that actually respect existing laws and existing norms, they can actually prompt innovation at a kind of local level. And I think, if there's one other thing that I'd say about the way that I think people coming at this from a more environmental perspective would say is, I think there's a big dispute over the nature of growth, what economic growth is. Because what I find that I suppose ecologists tend to assume is that more growth necessarily means more resource use rather than more efficient resource use. And I think it kind of goes back to this idea of like where GDP comes from. And the answer is that kind of GDP is kind of first invented when, we have a series of economic crises where people are kind of thrown out of work, there's mass unemployment, incomes are kind of dropping, and we're kind of looking for some tool to find out, or some measure to find out if various government interventions are working to kind of fix things back into some kind of equilibrium. And that's really great. No one likes unemployment. Mass unemployment's worse. We're facing that right now. And so as a result, GDP measures, important. But that doesn't necessarily mean growth in the kind of broader sense. In the broader sense, we mean basically people being able to live good lives with access to the goods and services that they need. Now, if you kind of think of it that way, then you kind of realize that, there might well be trade-offs. In fact, there's bound to be trade-offs at various points in terms of resource use. But it's not quite the same impression that GDP has, which is like always increasing incomes through more exploitation of resources. So I think properly construed, a kind of market approach to living well would say that actually you've got to include the costs, include kind of increasingly scarce resources in your measures. And in fact, under the right circumstances, a kind of commercial order is capable of kind of shepherding common resources effectively and actually saving more of them for future generations. You have to set the institutional framework correctly, but they're not quite at loggerheads in the way that I think some kind of ecologists think about it when they think about capitalism. I mean, there is actually one other person who I could name drop at this point, who we've actually used in the kind of redrafting of the paper, and that's Ilya Mutasashvili at the University of Pittsburgh. He's an associate professor there, and he's got some very interesting work on the role of individualism, broadly construed. It's not just sheer economic individualism; it's like social individualism and the ability to shepherd common resources. And he kind of uses, I think, measures of forestry and increased reforestation in commercial orders to illustrate how individualist societies are actually very capable of looking after common resources, precisely because people can be, in the appropriate framework, can be made to take responsibility for their actions in a way that can be harder in kind of more collectivist societies.
You just complicate everything, don't you, Nick?
That's right. I try and keep it simple, but yeah, it's these things do get complicated.
No, and that's part of the fun too. And I always wondered, surely there are some of these solutions that appeal to everyone, but I wonder to what degree there's too much crossover. It's just part of politics is expressing difference, and we like arguing and dividing ourselves into teams and yelling about it. But I see a lot to like about it. I can read books from some of the more like right-leaning or market-friendly people I know who like Elinor Ostrom's work, and also stuff like Kate Rayworth and Donut Economics, and say like there's great ideas and that are super creative in both of these. I wish we could get together and talk more on this level rather than just screaming about markets versus states, which it seems like 95, 6, 7% of the conversation is still on that level anyways, right? Why can't we get beyond it?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's okay, because this is kind of, as much as I dislike it, especially when I'm getting this in my kind of peer review responses, when I'm getting these, when I'm getting my various papers out. I mean, it is also how progress happens, people being angry, people thinking that some point is completely disastrous, completely, complete misconception, and arguing about it in the literature. That's the way that these ideas get tested. In fact, you can kind of see that happening in real time right now in epidemiology. There's we're trying to figure out from a very, very uncertain, kind of very, very ignorant standpoint. It's a brand new virus, this coronavirus that we're handling, and people don't like the debate often, because they think, we should just like rally behind the official message. And I think official messages are necessary. This is a classic kind of public good problem we're kind of dealing with. But at the same time, it's very important that science carries on, and the science it's not neat. It's very messy. There's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of disagreement. It sometimes gets personal as well. But you've got to allow it, because it's the only way that these things can kind of can proceed. So and some people enjoy it, some people don't like it, but it's how progress happens. And so hopefully, if we provoke some debate, we can carry on this conversation here or another forum, and and see what I've got wrong, and see what I can refine to kind of make my arguments better.
Well, if someone wanted to follow up with your work, to learn more about this, I feel like we barely scratched the surface. There's a lot here, and it's very interesting. I like reading people, all of the traditions I named. I think there's something of value to learn from and to dig into. So where might someone even do this beyond this podcast? I
think you could just start at ncowen, ncowen.net. That's got a link, several links to my various accounts with academia.edu and SSRN if people are interested in looking at my work. I'd be delighted if people wanted to follow me on Twitter, which I'm on too often for the kind of work that I do. And, that's another way of kind of carrying on the discussion in a more informal setting. So, ncowen.net would be, there's a few things there, but more importantly, there's links to where all the papers are.
Great. Thank you. We should just have you back on too. There's a whole another thing we could do about blockchain and also Elinor Ostrom. I bet there's a bunch more we could talk about. So maybe we'll have to do that in the future.
Oh yeah. Ostrom and blockchain. There's a lot of potential overlap. Yeah. So be delighted to explore that with you, Ross. And, good luck with your work.
And you as well. Well, thanks for being here, Nick. And thank you for listening. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, on Stitcher. Tell your friends. I hope you found this interesting. I hope we were able to sufficiently cover it. And we'll catch you next time. Well, thank you so much for listening. If you like the show, please rate and review it in Apple Podcasts and or Stitcher. It really helps us a lot to get this content to a wider audience. If you think what we're doing is useful, interesting, fun, hopefully all three, we'd certainly appreciate your rating and review. You can keep up with Nori at nori.com, where there is a newsletter. That's nori.com/subscribe. There's podcasts. There's a whole bunch else. Or you can send us an email at podcast@nori.com. We are also now on Patreon at patreon.com/noripodcasts if you'd like more content, engagement, and community. And thank you so much for your support.